Hello everyone, and welcome to this new episode in our TCA review channel. We hope that you appreciated the previous one, the one in which we talked about one of our books from our library. And this is also another book from the library as well. This was donated to us through the Ahuat Foundation. They have this project in which their members and their patrons and their donors, they donate books that they don't have any particular use for, or they're trying to clear out in order to get more space, and they needed organizations who are interested in cultural and social preservation. So the Collectors Admiralty stepped in to assist them in the matter. And today we're actually going to be taking one of these books into account. So it's basically the SF Science Fiction and Adventure book series, and it's from the Science Fiction and Adventure Library. And as you can clearly see over here, it's the foreign language publishing house of Moscow. More specifically, the thing which really stood out for us was printed in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And all these authors that you see over here, the ones that are mentioned in the front and in the back, are all mostly dead. I confirmed of Valentina Zhuravlyova and of Anatoly Dnieprev as well. So they've passed away. The vast majority of them aren't amongst us in the living anymore. And there's very little information actually about them as far as Wikipedia is concerned. So if you wanted to actually find out more about them, well, you'll actually need to go over through the Russian version of Wikipedia. So you'll have to actually change the language to Russian and read it over there, or you'll have to learn the language and become one with the people and find that information out essentially. So what is this book essentially? Well, it's a collection of 7 short stories, one of which is Destination Amaltheia. And so far I have actually read up till the 3rd story, which is the Maxwell equations, and it's all science fiction based. The vast majority of them are science fiction based with some elements of adventure added in. Now, they deal with science fiction themes, obviously, but they also have a very obvious, very prominent Soviet perspective. They're very much propaganda for the time, and in a lot of ways they capture some of that ethos which characterized Soviet propaganda, like the picture, like the posters that they made, and their entire library of cultural contributions, such as the Alexandrov ensemble, which is a big deal. It used to be the Red Army Corps. It became the Alexandrov ensemble, I believe, after the fall of the Soviet Union, so after 91. And it's quite fun, like, just to give an example from the very first story, and it's translated from the original Russian into English such that it's available to a larger audience, and it contains these small little illustrations in between stories, like before the introduction of the story itself. So just giving as an example, reading from this portion, the first book, in fact, which we did was the Political and Social History of Hindi and Urdu. So just like that, I'm going to be reading from the book. So The Astronaut by Valentina Zhuravlyova. I think I should begin by explaining in a few words the reason that brought me to the Central Astronautics Archive. My story might otherwise seem incomplete. I am a spaceship physician with 3 astro flights to my credit. Back then they actually assumed that flying up and down into space with human beings in them would not only be an eventuality, it would be considered an inevitable progress towards greatness and one more step for mankind essentially. And you could tell by that perspective that they were very optimistic about it. So the space race was fully on. An aside, my apologies. My subject is psychiatry, or rather astropsychiatry as it is called nowadays. The problem which I am working on at present first arose years back in the 1970s. In those days, flights to Mars took over a year, to Mercury just under 2 years. The engines only worked at takeoff and touchdown. No astronomical observations were carried out in flight. Sputnik mounted observatories did that. Dating over here. So what could the crew do during those long months? Practically nothing. Forced inactivity led to tension, to nervous breakdowns and mental disorders. No amount of reading or listening in could make up for what the first spacemen lacked on board ship. For what they lacked was work, the hard, creative work to which they were accustomed. It was then that the principle of hobby-minded personnel selection was first advanced. The nature of the hobby, it was thought, was entirely immaterial, so long as it gave the astronaut something to do during the flight. And thus, we got pilots who had a passion for mathematics, navigators keen on ancient manuscripts, poetry writing engineers, etc. There was a new entry in the astronaut's certificates, the famous item 12. Interests other than professional. However, a breakthrough in rocket technology soon provided a new solution of the problem. Ion engines cut travel between planets to a few days. Item 12 was dropped. Some years later, however, the problem reappeared with a vengeance. Mankind had mastered interstellar travel, yet though the speed of ion rockets were eventually stepped up to suboptical, journeys to even the nearest stars took up to 20 years. Item 12 was back in the flying certificates. In terms of actual rocket, control crews were occupied no more than 0.01% of flight time. TV faded away a few days after blastoff. Radio lasted another month, and there were still years and years ahead. Rockets were manned by crews of 6 to 8 in those days, not more. Tiny cabins and a 150-foot long greenhouse were all the living space they had. It is difficult for us who fly in interstellar liners to imagine how people in those days did without all those gyms, swimming pools, stereo theaters, and promenade galleries. But I have digressed without beginning my story. And essentially the story is about the astronaut. It's about this one specific astronaut, Alexei Sarubin, and how essentially Alexei Sarubin was responsible for one of his very major contributions essentially to this whole story's universe's most famous flight, an expedition to Bernard's Star, which was pivotal essentially to the achievements for flight there and back. And that's just one of the stories. I could explain most of the plot as it happens. I choose not to. The only thing you need to know is that there is a lot of theme areas over here of the greater good. Our good must supersede my selfish interests, and so on and so forth. You know, red commie stuff, or as most Americans used to call it, the red shit which we don't need. Over the Abyss and the Maxwell equations are an interesting take. The Maxwell equations in particular is an interesting take on how the commies essentially viewed Nazism and how they viewed being conquered by something that was evil, which in fairness, communism was evil as well. Communism in the context of Stalinism and Leninism specifically is evil because it's based on exploitation, and it is also based, on the inherent capacity of having hierarchies which must always be obeyed and must always be held far superior to the necessity implied and implicit individualism that all human beings have. So it's a fault in communism, which does make it an interesting topic in literature. And this is an interesting book. For one, it was originally published. Let me just see if I could find the original date in which it was actually published. Just give me a moment. There isn't one over here. One can assume that this is actually from, yes, this is from 1965. Yes, it is from 1965. The reason being that The Astronaut, which was written by Valentina Zhuravlyova, who was born in 1933, she published it in 1960. And as is the case with most books which were published at the time, it is a product of its time as well. So the descriptions that it gives of the authors isn't standardized or given to the tendency of us just wanting to know exactly the publications that were made, where the author is at the moment, how many kids they have, or how many people live with them, and which of their publications is best known. Were they given any rewards or awards for their achievements within the field of literature itself? And what's even more interesting is that there isn't a blurb at the back. You might have noticed it when I was actually going over through showing the book itself. It covers most of the blurbs within the context of these pages. So, just to give you an example, Valentina Zhuravlyova, born 1933, received her training at a medical institute. She was probably prompted to try her hand at scientific fiction, scientific fiction, just to separate it from science fiction, so it's hardcore science-based. By the almost fantastic possibilities offered in the field of medicine, the reader will particularly enjoy the bold flights of fancy in her scientific thinking. The Astronaut, published in 1960, is one of her latest creations. If we take another example, Alexander Belayev, 1884 to 1942, a notable writer of science fiction with a hard and amazing life story. For years, tuberculosis of the spine kept him confined to his bed, yet he was able to enjoy a full and interesting life. He studied law, attended the conservatoire, worked on newspapers and periodicals, and was deeply interested in science and technical problems. Belayev produced a big selection of science fiction books. The Amphibian, which was actually published by them, the foreign language publishing house. Professor Dovell's Head, The Island of Dead Ships, The Last Man from Atlantis, A Jump into Nothingness, and others, which we will only know about if we look further into it. Essentially, these stories are this book over here, the foreign language publishing house's books. I tried finding it online, and to the best of my ability, I hope that I could actually get an e-copy of it. I wasn't able to. So what I'll do is that in case I find an e-copy of any work which was published by the Foreign Language Publishing Institute, I'll include it in the description. And if you want to read this book, then you'll actually need to come over to the Collectors Admiralty. You need to head over directly to our headquarters. One of our TCA representatives will need to monitor you when you're reading the book itself, because this is invaluable. You know, it is a representation of the Soviet Union, so it's a relic of its time. And a fool would hand over a book, but an even bigger fool would return it. Likewise, a thief doesn't steal books because they don't need it, but a reader essentially does not need to return a book because they cherish it, because they hold it with regard. And I do hold this book with regard, and In case I'm able to find any other work published by the Foreign Language Publishing Institute, I'll include it in the description. For the time being, I thank you for your time. And please be sure to click the like button, the subscribe button, and you don't need to click the bell. Just the subscription and the likes are enough to assist us as far as these videos are concerned. And we look forward to your comments. More specifically, your comments on what do you think we should cover next, or if there's any book in particular that stood out for you, that really inspired you into your journey, whether it be science fiction, fantasy, what have you. We look forward to those comments. We'll get back to you on them, and that's a good point as any to conclude this video. Thank you for your time. Take care.